Hello, this presentation will be about the end of Reconstruction in America and political cartoon you'll see here, which we'll talk about a little more as we go through, make more sense. But you see two white men with guns to the head of an African American, and it says, of course, he wants to vote the Democratic ticket. So we'll explain what that is all about. All right. Reconstruction is going to happen after the Civil War. So first, just to refresh your memory about the Civil War. Civil War happened between 1861 and 1865. North versus South. The North wins. Slavery ends. What the Civil War was about, you hear, well, with slavery, states' right. Slavery, without slavery, there is no Civil War. Can be more complicated than that for sure. However, had the issue of slavery been addressed in the U.S. Constitution in 1789, the Civil War doesn't happen. So the Civil War definitely has a connection to slavery. Slavery is ended with the end of the Civil War. And a very important point is most of the fighting happened in the South. Near the end of the war, to try to encourage the South to surrender, the Northern military commanders make the decision to destroy Southern property and land. So cities, railways, farms are destroyed throughout the South. So it really needs to be rebuilt afterwards. And that's what's going to lead to Reconstruction. So Reconstruction is a name given to more than just rebuilding a railway line or a bank in a southern city. It's given to the process to reunite the entire nation and rebuild the South without slavery. I mean, the nation was torn apart. The Civil War, until during the Vietnam War, more Americans died in the Civil War than every other war in American history combined. World War I, World War II, Revolutionary War. So it took a humongous toll on the country. So it has to try to bring the country back together. It's going to last from 1865 to 1877. Abraham Lincoln is assassinated right after the Civil War ends. So some of the ideas are his, however, but then Andrew Johnson, who takes over for him, Ulysses S. Grant, who's the following president, they're all the president in charge of the Reconstruction time period. And the ideas change over time. There was one idea that was successful was the Freedmen's Bureau, and this was created to provide relief and education to poor Southerners, white or black. So 1860s, 1870s, at that point in time, the idea of public education for everybody did not exist. Many people, just based on economic circumstances, especially as farmers, even at a young age, they need to work the fields for their family. So they would not be able to get an education. And if you were black, a slave in the South, you would have been prohibited to get an education. So this is going to help to, try to bring, whether white or black, those people up to having more opportunities by giving them, a basis of education for reading, writing, math. And there was debate, however, in the government on how to rebuild the South. There are more extremist views that want to really punish the South. There are those who want to just kind of reunite the country and move on, despite how terrible the Civil War was. But one thing that's going to happen during Reconstruction is there are 3 amendments added to the Constitution. Sometimes they're called the Civil War amendments. The first one in 1865, right after it was actually approved by Congress, but not ratified until after the Civil War, but approved during the Civil War, was the official end of slavery. Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation during the Civil War that ended slavery, but only in areas that were in rebellion against the North. So if, Kentucky was a border state, which some Kentuckians fought for the South, some for the North, but they didn't really secede, so those people could still hold slaves. If it was an area in Tennessee that the North had reconquered, they could continue having slaves when the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. But 1864, it's officially outlawed. 1868, the 14th Amendment provides for equal protection of the law, meaning doesn't matter your race, your religion, whatever. The law is a law. It applies the same to everybody. The 14th Amendment, you'll hear that in this class later in the year. You'll hear it if you have government right now or else in the spring. If you just pay attention to the news, even minimally, you'll hear the 14th Amendment. There's oftentimes, even modern days, where cases where a group of people could be based on race, religion, sexual orientation, ethnicity, whatever. If they feel like they are not being given fair treatment, if it gets to a court case, especially a Supreme Court case, that issue of the 14th Amendment may be the basis for their argument why things should change. And the 15th Amendment gave all men the right to vote in 1870. Effectively, it's going to give black men the right to vote as white men could have voted beforehand. Women still do not have the right to vote. It's going to be 50 more years for that to happen. But now regardless of race, in America, you're allowed to vote in 1870. All right, Reconstruction South. So in the South, Democrats held most government positions prior to the Civil War. After the Civil War, most government positions are held by Republicans, which was the party of Abraham Lincoln, who was the president during the Civil War, who ended slavery. The political parties at the time, and I try to keep, this last, free of my political leanings or, anything like that, but just so we can understand what's going on. Today, you may hear the term conservative and liberal, and those may be a better way to describe the political parties back then than the names. So it's a name, a liberal or conservative. A lot of times people use them as like a negative. Oh, that person's liberal, that person's conservative, as a put down. But a liberal is somebody who is more open to change. Basically, they think maybe there could be progress to fix problems. That things need to change. A conservative is someone who feels like things are good the way they are, or maybe they were even better in the past. Maybe typically they want less government involvement in things. So in 1860s, Democrats today would be liberal, or another term you might hear is the left. Democrats would be on the left or liberal today. In the 1860s, the Democrats would have been more conservative or on the right of the political spectrum. And Republicans would have been, they were a new party. They were more liberal and more on the left. So they kind of, from today, liberals and Democrats, you almost think they were reversed as far as, their political views at the time. Because most political positions were held by Republicans in the South, which had for a long time been a Democratic, conservative stronghold, there's going to be a lot of opposition to Reconstruction. Some of this is due to how Republicans were able to vote in or get elected, more people. African Americans can vote now, and they're going to probably, and many of them would side with Abraham Lincoln for ending slavery, but also many ex-Confederate soldiers, depending on the state, but they at least in the early elections, were unable to vote, which brought down the number of Democrats that were registered to vote or able to vote in the election. So there's a lot of opposition in the South. A group, the KKK, Ku Klux Klan forms. They use violence and terror against African Americans. They're going to be, as I'll mention here later, it's going to have a not as big of an impact early on during Reconstruction, because Reconstruction is going to see some success and progress for equality in our country. But by 1876, Republicans begin losing power in the North and in the South. And they're going to lose the ability to have the U.S. Congress really fund and operate the Reconstruction programs. So all federal troops are removed from the South in around that time. And that's going to be huge, because the troops remained in the South post-Civil War. They were there as protection, protection for the newly freed slaves, to make sure they're having basically a fair share in life. And that is not going to continue to exist when the federal troops leave. So a huge reason why the end of Reconstruction is going to lead to problems in the future for race relations is the federal troops leaving. And then also, as the Democrats, who had that more conservative leaning, they wanted to have things go back to the way basically went back when slavery existed days. Democrats coming to power is also going to be a huge problem for ending equality, or ensuring that equality does not happen in the South. 1876 election, this is really the final nail in the coffin for Reconstruction. The Republican wins. Rutherford B. Hayes, who's pictured there. So Abraham Lincoln was Republican. He died. Andrew Johnson takes over. He's Republican. Then Ulysses S. Grant gets elected. He's Republican. Rutherford Hayes, again, Republicans win, so you'd think that would be good for Reconstruction. But his victory over the Democrat Samuel Tilden was in a very close election and very controversial. There's basically a deal behind closed doors to ensure Hayes won the election. So there were 3 states that were contested, that were basically we need to do recount. There was too close to call who won: Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana. And the deal was made between Republicans and Democrats. Hayes would have had to win all 3 to get the election. If Tilden just won one of those 3, he's the president. Republicans don't want to lose the presidency, so they say, if you give us those 3 states, we get the president. we'll end Reconstruction. We'll pull the federal troops out. And so the Democrats go along with that because that's ultimately what they wanted anyway. And the Republican Party won't continue to have that power that they had, for about 20 years from the Civil War onward. The KKK, they're going to, again, like I said, they formed 1866. The group formed. They spread to every southern state by 1870. They try to use violence, intimidate African Americans and white Republicans. But the influence dies off in the early 1870s. It's not really a big thing. And part of that is because federal troops are in the South. Federal troops are there to protect African Americans. But the KKK, and we're going to learn more about them later on, I just mentioned them here as well, but when we get to the 1900s, they have a rebirth in the 1910s. And it's in part because a lot of nativists, people who like basically who's here right now, they don't want new people coming to America. And so their target, it definitely is going to always include African Americans. But those newer immigrants we talked about back when we were going over the Industrial Revolution, like people from Italy or Russia, Southern Eastern Europe, Catholics, Jewish people as well, are going to be targeted. So the KKK is going to kind of have a rebirth in the early 1900s. But their tactics, burning crosses, staging rallies and parades, and also lynching, which a lynching is a group of people, a mob of people would go and they kill somebody, typically by hanging. It might be in front of a large crowd. And it's going to be for some crime or alleged crime, but with no trial present. The mob is going to be the judge and the jury and the executioner. All right, so end of Reconstruction. That's the topic for this PowerPoint. So Reconstruction ends, and segregation is going to begin in the South. So there was slavery before the Civil War. Life is very bad. If you're African American, you're a slave. You don't have freedom. All right. Civil War happens, and then the end during Reconstruction, life is getting better. There's improvements. There's freedom. There's education reforms. It's not perfect by any stretch, but there's African Americans getting elected even to U.S. Congress positions. Hundreds are elected to state and local offices in the South. So there is some progress, but that progress is going to definitely take a big step backwards with the end of Reconstruction, as those federal troops were removed. The Southern Democrats take back over in the South. And the new governments, which are much more like the governments that were in place during slavery times, they passed some laws to try to get around some of the amendments that were passed. So slavery, they can't get rid of slavery, but they figure out some ways to make it very difficult for African Americans to vote. So they passed something called the poll tax. The poll tax is a tax that you have to pay in order to vote. Completely illegal. However, it was in place for almost 100 years in the South. Literacy test. You have to show that you can read and write in order to vote. Again, completely illegal. If you're 18, if you're a citizen, you're allowed to vote. But they put in place these literacy tests to try to stop people from voting. Now, white or black, you might be poor and unable to pay a tax to vote. White or black, you might not know how to read. You maybe never went to school. You can't write. So either way, you could possibly have the inability to pay a poll tax or pass the literacy test. To get around that, to ensure that all whites had the right to vote in the South, there was something called the grandfather clause that was added to these laws in the South. And it said if your father or grandfather could vote before 1867, you would not have to pay the poll tax. You do not have to pass the literacy test. Well, since the 15th Amendment went into effect in 1870, if you were white in the South, your father or grandfather could vote before 1867. If you're black and living in the South, your father or grandfather could not vote before 1867, so you wouldn't have to pay the poll tax and the literacy test. So they could not officially say if you're black, you have to pay a poll tax. But with that grandfather clause, it more or less makes it if you're black, you have to pay a poll tax. If you're black, you have to pay a literacy test. Any other, white, you do not have to worry about that. So those are examples of segregation laws in the South, the poll tax, literacy test. And then these Jim Crow laws are another one. Maybe you've heard that term, Jim Crow law. Jim Crow laws are just laws that require segregation. They're very common in the South, starting in the 1880s and going into the 1960s. But it would just be that example of having a separate hotel or rail car or theater section for African Americans and whites. And typically, as the quote says here, the African American sections are the most uncomfortable, uncleanest, and unsafest places to be. And also the idea of miscegenation was a term that was to describe the mixing of races through marriage or procreation, having kids, and that would be outlawed in most places in the South as well. If you're white and black, you couldn't marry, you couldn't have a kid together. So examples of Jim Crow laws, that just separate facility, a separate restaurant or restroom, you can't marry somebody of a different race. that you have that poll tax, the literacy test, and you can think of what those negative impacts are, and you'll answer that here on the Ed Puzzle. Plessy versus Ferguson is a landmark case. This is really going to be a third big issue that's going to be why segregation was such a problem in our country. So you had the removal of federal troops. You had the Democrat regaining power in the South to kind of try to institute laws that were very similar to slavery times. And this Supreme Court decision in Plessy versus Ferguson is going to be that third big reason why segregation was such a problem. African Americans challenged segregation laws in court in the late 1800s. All right, the U.S. Supreme Court had ruled that the 14th Amendment, saying equal protection of the laws, only applies to state governments. And private individuals and businesses can practice segregation if they like. So 1896, this case, Plessy versus Ferguson, gets to the Supreme Court, and it's, the hope would be on the African American side that this can end that issue of, segregation in the South. This is Homer Plessy. He is of mixed race. He's, white and black descent. As far as any court would be concerned, public opinion would be concerned, he's a black man. But notice the picture, that's an actual picture of him, versus the drawing from a political cartoon of the time, much darker skin, which the purpose behind that would be to play on those, racist feelings that many people would have had that back then, especially in the South, that no black man or woman should be able to be in the presence of a white person. And so the issue here for him is, as the drawing is showing, he purchased a ticket on a train in Louisiana. He sits in the whites only section, refuses to leave, and he's arrested for violating a Jim Crow law. This is very similar to the Rosa Parks situation, which you may have more knowledge of. That's going to be much later on. There's going to be success in that situation. This one, unfortunately, there is not. So Plessy's lawyer, they argue in court, he was arrested wrongfully. That law violates equal treatment under the law. According to the 14th Amendment, he shouldn't never have been arrested. Supreme Court, however, does not see it that way. And the justices on the Supreme Court, they rule 8-1 that segregation is allowed if, and this is a very important quote, separate but equal facilities are provided to African Americans. And this is going to really just more or less say segregation is 100% allowed in America. And throughout the first half of the 1900s, many businesses and government facilities are going to continue that segregation policy because the U.S. government said through the Supreme Court ruling, you can have, if you have separate but equal facilities, you can segregate. The reality is they're never equal. They are separate. They're never equal. You have a white school and a black school. The conditions aren't the same. The quality of books and things like that were not the same. At a restaurant, the tables for the African Americans may have been, behind the building next to the dumpster. It's not equal. However, the not equal part didn't matter to law in America in the first half of the 1900s or end of the 1800s. So when you think of what factors caused racism to become institutionalized in the U.S., think back to those three big reasons. I'll let you answer here, and then I'll go over the three factors next. All right, it should have been all of the above. Removal of federal troops from the South, Democratic Party gaining control of state governments, U.S. Supreme Court's Plessy versus Ferguson separate but equal decision. All three of those things together, kind of lead racism to become more institutionalized. All right, the Great Migration, I'll click off my video here. So the Great Migration, this is just, I'm going to go over this now because it kind of ties in with what we did last week about the Industrial Revolution and then today about the end of Reconstruction. So the Industrial Revolution and institutional racism caused by the end of Reconstruction lead to the Great Migration. Think migration movement. Well, who's moving here? The Great Migration is the mass movement of African Americans from the rural South, farming areas in the South, to the urban or cities of the North between 1916 and 1930. And that movement is to escape discrimination in the South, but also for better paying manufacturing jobs in the North. It transforms the North economically as more workers and consumers are there for these growing cities. It also, as a positive, will lead to recognition of African-American cultural talents, such as in art, music, literature. Most famously, the Harlem Renaissance topic we'll talk about later in the year. But when you think, okay, Great Migration, just if you think of the world we live in today, it was different 100 years ago. If you think along racial lines, it was the makeup of the country was different. Pre-1916, before the Great Migration, if you are for African Americans in the country, most African Americans would have lived in the South and really the Southeast, in these former, slave holding areas of our country. And it's just partly a product of, for most people in general, white, black, whatever, you would have lived and died, even if you lived to be 80 or 90 years old, you probably within, a relatively small area, distance between the place where you were born and where you died, because just it was more difficult to travel and to move. Cars are an invention, but they're not until you get to the 1920s. They're not like common. Airplanes are an invention, but it's definitely not for passenger travel. Trains are around, and they'll become more affordable even in the 1800s. But in general, the idea to pick up and move, it would be much more difficult than it would be today. If I want to get a job in Phoenix, Arizona, I could right now go online and look up for jobs. I might be able to interview online. I might be able to look up home online and buy that. And when I travel there, if I don't travel by plane, if I'm going to move my things, I can drive on a 4-lane highway the entire way there. So it's just much easier now than it would have been back then. So most people, just in general, it's going to be tough to move. But for African Americans, it would be even more difficult. End of slavery. Slavery ends. You get your freedom. However, beyond that, you don't get much else. There's a system called sharecropping. Most African Americans worked as sharecroppers, which was very similar to slavery, just basically a different name. You're working maybe on the same exact field as you were working on beforehand. So that's an issue as far as not having much income to afford to move. And then just, how are you going to contact somebody from Ohio or Michigan to get a job is difficult. But that's going to start to change here with the Great Migration. And the makeup of the country is going to be different. Instead of almost all African Americans before the Great Migration lived in the South, worked on farms. In the North, you have some, but very little diversity. In the West, very little diversity. Again, there are some African Americans who fled after the end of slavery and moved and settled and had a new life out here. But in the Western half, there's a little more diversity as far as, there's Native Americans who've been pushed off and settled in the West. There are, Hispanic Americans who would have, for a long time, lived in the Southwest because that Southwest used to be part of Mexico. But not much, as far as black-white diversity. Most African Americans would live in the South and nowhere else in the country. So in 1910, 7 million African Americans live in the South, less than 1 million live in the rest of the country. And, the picture here, this shows what is a more modern home, but it would have been not much different than, say, the slave quarters that would have existed, and maybe that same exact farm that this picture was taken on prior to the Civil War. Why are people leaving the South? Well, they want to get away from things like this. So you have, as the headline says, 3,000 will burn Negro. It's not did, it's will. This man here, John Hartfield, will be lynched. So again, it's will. This is being reported. This is going to happen, and it happens, and nothing happened about it. No one stopped it. Even the governor of Mississippi, that's where this is. It's a New Orleans paper, but the story is about in Mississippi, says he's powerless to prevent it. Thousands of people are going to show up, and they're going to. The man who's going to be killed here, he allegedly assaulted a young woman. So he's alleged of a crime. However, he's not going to get a trial. So whether he did it and should have been punished, or he did not and is wrongfully punished, he is going to be, taken by a group. He's under police custody too. It's not like they took him from his home. He's under police custody. He's in a hospital. He's under police custody, taken and hanged for his alleged crime. This is not a single story that something like this happened. So getting away from that would be very important for many people, many African Americans at that time. And so between 1960 and 1918, there's like 500 African Americans that are leaving the South per day. If political leaders in the South, despite the segregationist laws, did not want this to happen, because that's a lot of labor that's leaving. And that, while it's going to be a positive economically for the North, it's going to be a negative for the South, that mass movement of people away from the South into the North. But so I mentioned, how do you find out about, today I could go online and find a job. This would be advertisements by northern manufacturers in the South that are looking for more and more workers. So they tell, $2.50 to $6 per day. It seems like nothing now, but would have been, pretty decent pay back then. In the North, and we'll get more to this later on, segregation still exists. It may not be as open. It might not be as egregious. Segregation is going to exist here. See a very rundown apartment complex that would be segregated housing in Detroit, Michigan. Same story is going to play out locally here. There is still going to be segregation in the North, just not going to be as open as the Jim Crow laws in the South. But by 1930, you can see 89% of the northern black population is urban, living in cities, while only 32% of the black population lives in cities in the South. I bring up those numbers just very similar to immigration, where you have many immigrants coming from Europe who are farmers. They came here with that skill as a farmer, just like many of these people during the Great Migration would have moved to the North with that skill as a farmer. But the farm jobs aren't available. The farmland isn't cheap enough, or available for them. So many settle as working in factories and cities, as opposed to maybe where they would have preferred to possibly continue working as a farmer. The Great Migration is going to give more opportunity for sure to African Americans in our country. It is not going to address the issue of segregation. That still is going to be a problem. There may be some progress with recognition of things like during the Harlem Renaissance. However, segregation in the early half of the 1900s is a very big problem, especially in the South, but also in the North.